Hey, you guys, this is Josh
And Carolyn.
with Homesteading Family, and welcome to this week's episode of the Pantry Chat Food for Thought.
This week, we are going to be answering your questions from the last few videos that we've done. We're going to be talking about herbs, medicinal herbs, cast iron seasoning and care.
Yep, canning meat, resilient homestead.
All right, lots of good stuff. So join us for this week's Q&A.
Okay, well, what has been going on with you?
You know, it is the beginning of the spring rush, or maybe it's middle beginning of the spring rush around here. So it feels fast. It feels like we just transitioned from like waiting for spring to get here. Is it ever going to hit? To now we're here.
Honestly,
and it's like go.
It feels a little like a yo-yo. We're a little bit later than a lot of y'all in the country, and we're still having, we had 29 degrees this morning.
We had a freeze.
We had like 27 the other morning. And so while the days are getting nice and spring's getting going, we get this real fluctuation. So you got to really watch the greenhouse. We've got starts out there.
You know what I did?
Got starts coming up. So it's going, but you keep getting stops.
I was a little early and I was hardening off a few starts for the cottage garden, and I did what I do every year, and I forgot that they were outside.
So easy to do this time of year.
I'm so sad. It was
so easy.
Luckily, it wasn't too many. It was just a few that I set out, but a couple of chocolate cherry, tomato plants, and some peppers. So even very experienced gardeners and homesteaders make mistakes like that. I just forgot it was there, and they completely got killed. So.
Life gets busy. So if you are hardening off starts right now, which is the process of transitioning them from starting inside to getting them ready to transplant outside, you need to make sure and bring them in if it's going to get too cold for them. And we've all done that. Last year, we've even got a video on it where I almost lost everything in the greenhouse, all of our starts. Like
we had a hard late freeze.
We had a hard freeze in the greenhouse, and I had a great trick that saved them. And so we'll try to link that video down below, because it helped a lot of people last year, and it'll happen again this year. But that's a tough one with starts when you live in an area that's transitioning in spring and still getting solid freezes at night.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I have been busy up in the garden. I've actually in both the cottage garden and the main crop garden, working on the perennial beds. The raspberries still needed to be pruned and tied up. I was a little late on that one. And the asparagus bed needed to be weeded and composted. And the cottage garden with all of my culinary and medicinal herbs and my perennial vegetables needed to get a little bit of weeding and a little bit of direction in there, and a little bit of help. So I've been working on this for the last week and a half probably, and I think wrapping up.
Yeah, cool.
Good.
All right.
What have you been up to?
Oh man, just lots of garden stuff. Garden starts from cabbages and broccolis to tomatoes, peppers. I got to get the cucumbers going, a little late on that. We've got more seedlings to start, getting ready to transplant. We've got peas in the ground. A little late on potatoes and onions, but those are about to go.
About ready.
And planting trees. We just got in another like 24 one-year-old trees, apples, semi-dwarfs and standards, and we're building a tree nursery that probably next year we're going to do a mass planting around the property.
Hopefully we'll do a video on this sometime soon, because this is a technique that is really saving us a lot of money on developing an orchard by bringing in very, very young trees, growing them out in our own nursery in a controlled setting inside the garden space, and growing them up a little bit bigger to get them out onto the property. And by doing that, we're able to bring trees in for a lot less cost.
$15 to $20 compared to $40, $50 and up for several year old trees. Now, it's going to obviously take longer to get to production. But we have a few trees here that are producing. And so it's certainly a great idea if you don't have any to buy some fuller size trees. But if you're really trying to plan out a property, it's much less expensive to buy those young trees, put them in a nursery, baby them a little bit, and then move them out as you will. And so I also seeded a whole lot of trees. Nut trees.
Right from seed.
Hazelnuts, hickory, which the hickory is a little experimental here. We know hazelnuts will do great. Even some pecans. My friend Casimir, if you remember, that was on with the Pantry Chat and pruning trees. He's experimenting with pecans, so we're going to try that in our area.
Some cold hardy pecans.
Yeah, and so a lot of seedlings in, along with some locust trees that are going to be some of our reparative nitrogen fixers.
Yeah.
And and moved the bean tunnel. Built a new bean tunnel that we're actually probably going to use this one as a hoop house and experiment with that. And did a whole video on that. Came out yesterday, I think?
Last week.
Last week, yeah. Okay. And so check that out on just a multi-purpose bean tunnel, tomato trellis, cucumber trellis, hoop house, whatever.
Oh, this has been a great system for us.
Yep. So it's busy.
Yeah, it is busy.
It's great. Springs.
And you know what I'm counting down here with the spring? I'm counting down, we're almost down to days that the cow calves and we're back in milk.
Yep.
Because we have been feeling the lack of milk around here.
Yeah. Mid-May, she's due. So
she's due. It's coming up.
She'll be coming up.
Getting really excited about that.
Yeah. So what tea is this you made today? This is really good.
Oh, let's see. You have the herbal chai from Farmhouse Teas. Ooh. And I know that's one that you really like.
That is really good.
If you guys haven't checked out Farmhouse Teas yet, it's a small company we absolutely love, and they make amazing teas. And they're also starting to make some dry medicinal mixes, like a fire cider mix, an elderberry syrup mix, and I hear there might be a wild cherry cough syrup mix in the works.
Wow. And then they make a specific packet for your herbal class as well, right?
Yeah, with all of the herbs that we use.
For Carolyn's herbal class.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
that's a real good package too.
Just been a great company to work with. Yeah. We really like them.
Yep.
So,
well, hey, we better get into questions here.
We have a few.
Keep moving through time. So we're answering your questions today from different videos over the past month or so.
Okay.
And let's see here. This is a pretty interesting one to start off with from Ganma Debbie Dixon. Actually, this was from Facebook. I was wondering, how difficult is it to become a homesteader, and how do you get started, and what are the requirements? Wow. Well, I don't know that we can answer all of that.
No, and I think you have to start with the thought of what is a homesteader, right? And that's a whole discison all in itself.
Which we've definitely covered in some past pantry chats, and we'll try to link that one down below. I think the encouragement that we give is to start where you're at, working with what you can. That's the best way to get started, is start building skills where you are. We've actually got a lot of pantry chats on this topic of working with what you have, from buying whole foods, cooking whole foods, storage, small scale gardening. There's a lot of things you can do right where you're at. That's the place to get started and maximize your space in your life with skills right where you are.
Right, exactly. So I think in order to answer her question of how difficult is it to become a homesteader, it shouldn't be too difficult all at once. It should just be the next step. It should just be taking the step to build one new skill at a time, really. If it's too difficult all at once, then it's going to be too difficult and you're not going to get very far or be very successful with it. So for most people, you really need to just take the next step. If you're not cooking from scratch already, that is a great next step to take wherever you're at. Start cooking from scratch.
Which means buying whole foods, either from the grocery store or, better yet, the local farmers market and your local growers.
Yeah, absolutely. And then slowly transition into growing some of your own food and preserving it. And I think those are the steps that you would start with there. And you don't want to ever take on too much, because then you can't keep up with all of the new skills you have to learn.
But it is work. And if it's a lifestyle that you're going to take on, you are going to put other things aside and other things away. It's going to take the place of other activities that you do. So if you are looking to truly move to a more homesteading, self-sufficient, sustainable life, it does take focus, and it does take work. It takes trial and error, besides learning from people that have gone ahead of you. And you're going to put aside some of your other habits and other hobbies, is what I was trying to say.
Well, and you might be able to really naturally, because right off you can stop going to the gym. You're going to be working instead, especially if you've got a garden or animals. And maybe you won't have to spend so much time going to health appointments. And you're probably going to enjoy your time gardening and doing some of those things enough that other hobbies will just kind of drop away. So hopefully it's an easy transition.
That's the short answer. Again, we've got several videos exploring this topic, and so we'll try to link some of those down below. Okay, let's get on to Tanya Smith on how to make your homestead resilient. Where do you suggest storing this excess fuel? We were talking about some of the things they have stocked up, and fuel is definitely one of those. I'm not sure how comfortable I would be with storing it close to the home. Do you have a separate storage just for fuel, for safety precautions? So in the ideal situation, you would have a very specific fuel storage place that, yes, would be away from other structures, would have a roof over it to protect it from sunlight and rain, and would have an airy structure around it. It doesn't have to be a room, but maybe a fence. That's what a lot of camps and different large properties have, and it would be lockable. That is ideal. Very few of us, I don't know that I've ever seen that on a homestead. I've seen it, I've worked on a lot of camps and different large properties, and that's usually what they do. That's the ideal. Most of us don't quite have that. We may not have enough space to get it that far away, or just time to build that. So yes, if you can, get it away from your buildings and store it separately, but you need the basics of keeping the sun off of it, keeping the weather off of it. You need to protect people like children from it that you don't want in there. Right. Our space is in an area of the barn. Now, our barn is not a wood barn, and it's in a very tucked in corner, not around a lot of flammables, other than just the structure, which is mostly metal. And it's very aerated. There's always air. Your fuel gases always go low and go out, and you're always going to have a little. So some people on a small scale keep it in their garage, which is okay. That's why your water heaters, your propane gas water heaters are elevated, and you just need to leave that vented. Okay. But you're definitely right. The further away from structures you can go while keeping it protected and contained and access protected from those that shouldn't have it is the best. And you just got to work somewhere from there and in between with what you've got. That's the case with most things. So very few of us have the ideal setup for just to anything. And that's definitely our goal, is to actually have a whole fuel center on the project. We've got a large property. We actually need some larger tanks and to actually have what I described, a roof structure and fenced and locked. That's just, we don't have the time or space to do that yet. We'll get there. So, yep. Okay, moving on to Claudia Smith on how to make your homestead resilient. Again, any tips on yeast? I assume getting yeast, because I know a lot of people are having that challenge. You mentioned you do a lot of bread baking. Okay. You know, the best thing to do, if we're assuming that this is a question on a challenge of getting yeast, is to transition to sourdough. Then you're not dependent on buying in yeast all the time, right? Because you're making your own, you're feeding your own. The downside to that is that it does take between about 4 to 6 weeks to actually mature a sourdough so that you're getting good rise on your breads. So the workaround for that is if you can find somebody who already has a mature sourdough starter and you can have them give you some, then you're just kind of off and running right to start. And, you know, when you get the hang of sourdough, it's so flexible. It's very, very workable, and it's a very easy thing to fit into a schedule once you get the feel for it and you get the hang of what you're doing with it. But it takes a while for a lot of people to kind of find their stride with sourdough because it's not quite, you know, that instant recipe, just add this amount for this exact amount of time. So cool. Yeah. Claudia also asks about cooking chili beans. Hers are usually tough. I know you've got a... Okay, usually tough. So Claudia, if you are pre-soaking them for 12 hours and then you're long cooking them for a couple hours and they're still tough, the chances are that you have old beans. That definitely happens after your beans get several years old. They can just get to a point where they never really get soft anymore. If you're at higher elevations, that can start being challenging and you really need to soak them. You can soak them up to 36 hours with changes of water. And I would really recommend doing that. Just soak them at room temperature and, you know, keep changing out the water about every 12 hours, putting fresh water in and keep them soaking. Okay. Another thing you can do is can them. If you can beans, they're most likely going to get soft. Even if they're older beans, it's a really good thing to do. You have to remember to simmer them for 30 minutes before you can them with all beans and legumes. But that can be a great way to break them down and get them soft. Cool. All right. Tyler Carelra on how to strip and reseason cast iron. After doing this process 4 times, my paper towel still had a little bit of residue on it. Not as much as the start, but it was not fully clean. Any suggestions? Do I just keep adding layers? Okay, I would just stick it back in the oven for a little bit without a new layer on it.
Just see if it needs a little bit more heat and a little more time. Different oils do take a little bit of different time. So it's just possible that you haven't baked that all the way on there yet. The other thing, you'd be amazed at how often I find that people's ovens aren't calibrated properly and they're not baking at the temperature they think they're baking at. It happens a majority of the times when people come to me with questions about bread baking and they're having a hard time getting their bread done or not be burnt and be done on the inside. It's almost always because their ovens are not calibrated properly. So just stick it back in and let it cook for another half hour, 45 minutes. See if that fixes it. If it doesn't, I just move on to cooking fatty things with it and maintaining it normally. That should go ahead and touch up that finish where you need it to.
And if you're not sure about temperature oven, you can get one of those little oven thermometers that are made to hang or sit in there and check it and see if it's lining up with your settings. And then maybe you need to get the oven serviced. Okay, Christine Peters on 3 homemade meals on the table. Hi, Carolyn. How do you keep your onions and your garlic fresh? I put them in a cupboard in a dark place, but they always seem to sprout, and sometimes the onions turn black. Could you let me know what you do to keep the onions and garlic fresh?
Well, dark is a great start to that, and you definitely need airflow around it.
Sounds like there's too much moisture in there.
There might be too much moisture. You want dry for onions, and you want cool. And that can be a challenge getting all of those elements together. If you read the old books, like if you go read the original Little House on the Prairie, the onions were always stored in the attic where it was a little bit warmer. Now, of course, their attic wasn't a well-insulated house, so it was still
freezing.
Cool.
It was cool, yeah.
But it was much drier because of the heat from the wood cook stove downstairs was drying out the air. Of course, it's winter air, so it's not in the root cellar. So that dry, cool, but not freezing, and with air circulation are your keys for garlic and for onions there.
Right. Real good.
Yeah.
Okay. Flounder milkshake. Okay, Flounder. On canning meat, why do my raw pack jars always end up half full? The jars seal, but when they're done, the meat is shrunk and there's not enough juices to cover the meat. Is this safe?
Okay, as long as your jar is still half full, then it is considered safe. And of course, you've canned it properly with good methods and it is well sealed. Then it is still considered safe at the half full mark. You know, this is why people hot pack meat instead of raw pack meat, because you actually get a more predictable end product. When you put raw meat into a jar, the liquid is going to come out of that meat, but you don't always know how much liquid. Right. So if you watch my raw pack video, you'll know on that one that I do usually add a little bit of water at the bottom, and that's because very rarely in my experience does enough liquid come out of the meat to actually cover it all the way and fill the jar up. Okay. So, you know, it's just because that's not really quantifiable. If that really bothers you, either add a little bit of liquid like I do in the bottom of the jar, or go to a hot pack method where you're cooking the meat in liquid and filling the jar, and then you'll have a much more predictable final product.
Cool. All right. Heather Foster on 15 medicinal herbs to grow.
Okay.
How do you cover echinacea roots in winter?
All right. That's a good one. So echinacea is one of the perennial herbs that I grow for medicine. So that means that the roots stay in the ground all winter long, even in our North Idaho winters. And then they grow back from that root in the spring. Right. And they'll do that year after year, and those roots get bigger until you're ready to harvest the whole plant and gather the roots for the echinacea. So in the fall, the plant just dies all the way back. In most areas, you can just leave it in that state right there, just where it dies back. In some areas where you get really, really cold, you need to put an extra layer of mulch over the roots themselves to protect them. Now, we always keep our soil covered, so we always have mulch on the garden, at least some of it.
You want to keep a blanket on your soil at all times if possible.
And that's for the health of the soil. So in most cases, that is just fine. That's all you need to protect your echinacea. You would only need to think about more mulch than that if you're probably zone 3 or below. And then you're going to get a pretty hard winter. But, you know, anything above that and you're probably fine.
Cool. All right, Cynthia Jordan asks on how to make your homestead resilient. Do you have a landline phone as well as a cell or ham radio? Yes, we do. Landline phone is great. If you're, and if you're so far out off grid, you may not be able to get one, but it is great. They generally don't go out when the power goes out, though sometimes they do. They're not supposed to, but we've sure had that happen.
We actually have zero cell service where we live, so we cannot depend on our cell service, which means we'd have to depend on Wi-Fi, which does go out regularly.
Right, and so we keep landline, but we keep an old phone that does not require electricity. We have several of those around the house, and because if your power goes out, and you want to call somebody, your cordless isn't going to do it. Even from the base,
even the one that has the cord on it
does not work when the power's out. Right. Yeah. So you want one of the old style dialers or push buttons, little simple corded phone.
A dialer's really getting back there in years.
It is.
Be kind of fun.
They had when I was a kid still. Okay, more cast iron questions here. Rena LaRue on how to choose a cast iron skillet.
Okay.
She says, I just purchased some Lodge bread pans. Ooh, 2 of them came so stuck together that we can't get them apart. We've tried cold water and also putting them in the freezer for a bit, but still no luck. I'm glad you didn't break them. Do you have any suggestions? Bought them new on eBay and the seller isn't very helpful. They've tried to use cold soapy water and yeah, she needs some help. Got any suggestions for that?
The first thing that I would do is try pouring oil around the edges where you can, just to kind of lubricate it. And of course, the oil is not going to hurt your cast iron at all. It's just going to make it better.
I was just saying, be careful with that water because water will expand a little bit when it freezes.
Right.
And especially if your freezer's so low. And so I've not seen, I don't know, because I've not tried it, but theoretically you could crack the cast iron if that water, got to the right temperature, expanded enough. So the oil's I like that.
I think that's a better option. And then I would assume that you've tried like a solid tap on the counter, not enough to crack your cast iron, but enough to just budge it a little bit. It sounds like it's just kind of wedged together. I would tend to go towards heat, and I understand that the heat will expand and maybe make it feel like it's more stuck. But if you can just get it to move a little bit, then you should be able to get them apart. So I would try oil, a solid smack on the counter just to try to get them to pop apart there. And then if that doesn't work, stick them into a hot oven and try to warm them up and then give them another solid smack.
And try it as they warm, because as that warms, they are going to move, and that may allow the oil to get into places and seep in, where it's stuck as there's some expansion there. And I would do that incrementally.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So, sorry about that, though. That's disappointing when you get something new you're excited about and it has a problem.
I fight with plastic 5-gallon buckets all the time, but getting stuck.
When
you store them and they all get stuck together, and sometimes it should be the simplest thing, but sometimes they just don't come apart. Yeah, they get suctioned on there. Okay, Cynthia Fed on immune boosting throat soother tea. Thank you for sharing this recipe. Would you mind sharing how you learned about how to just kind of herbal medicine recipes in general?
Herbal medicine, lots and lots of trial and error, and having family and friends who I wanted to be able to help. So lots of reading, lots of hours of studying, working with some professional herbalists, and quite a few classes that I've been able to take.
And having a surprisingly willing guinea pig, I must say, to give myself a little credit in that journey.
That helps so much to be able to experiment on a poor willing victim.
All righty. Okay, Jay on how to clean cast iron, part 3. Great videos, Carolyn. You mentioned in a previous video about modern cast iron not being very smooth. Could it theoretically be sanded until smooth and then reseasoned?
Theoretically, yes, it could. Actually, a lot of people do that, and I'm sorry, I am so bad with the different tools, but people take grinders.
They grind them, yes.
They take grinders and they smooth them, and can actually get that pan down to very smooth, supposedly. I've never tried it. We've never tried it. And then, yes, you would just reseason it after you do that. So it works out really well for a lot of people who are tool savvy like that.
Just go easy. Be careful with that grinder inside a pan. If you haven't worked with tools a lot, that thing could get away from you. And of course, you could real fast with a grinder put a divot in it or go too much. So little bits at a time is what I would say. Well, I haven't done it, but working with things like that.
Absolutely.
Just a little bit at a time. Okay, let's see here. Get to the next page. Okay, Amina Meziana on how to strip and reseason cast iron. We've got a lot of cast iron videos today. Hi there, love this video. What does it mean if my pans, no matter how many times I've scrubbed them, are still rusty?
Sometimes you will still get a little bit of rust on your fingers, depending on, I think it must have to do with the actual iron composition, the way it's used, because some really have a tendency to do that. You've stripped it down, you've washed it, and you just can't ever get it to come completely clean without rust. I would say do the best you can and then move on with the next step. You don't want to wait too long after you get it stripped, because then you will get rust. Those things just rust amazingly,
that's
just
the
even out
nature
in the
of cast
air.
iron. That's why it's got to stay.
That's why it's got to stay seasoned.
Yeah.
So I would just get it as clean as you can and then go ahead and move on.
Okay, so one more before we get going. Karen Horn on 15 medicinal plants to grow. I live in a condominium community, so I can't just start digging up the yard.
That would be good. Don't do that.
Right, but maybe you could get the group together to do a community garden.
That would be good too.
But so we're both elderly and had to leave our beautiful country home and move to the city, closer to doctors. We sure have seen people do that and understand that. And so my question is, can you grow these herbs in pots, and will they still come back year to year?
Yes, most of them would work very well in that. You just have to remember not to let your soil dry out when they go dormant in the winter.
Yeah.
So even then, they need some amount of moisture in the soil.
And you're going to need to feed the soil. Anything in pots, you're going to need to feed the soil at least annually, if not a few times a year, depending on the plant and the size of the pot. So do your research. But you just got to give them their nutrition if they're going to give back to you. And
do remember that even though the tops of the plants don't get bigger than something you might be able to grow in a smaller pot, a lot of these herbs you're growing for their roots. So say if you're growing echinacea in a pot or a valerian in a pot, you want to go ahead and make sure to give it a nice deep pot.
Absolutely. And that kind of ends with the first question about getting started and starting small. And I think it's great that you're just trying to do what you can where you're at.
Right where you are.
The more of you that do that, the better off you are, and we all are.
Yeah.
All right, you guys. Well, it's been good hanging with you today.
Yeah, well, I'm not exactly sure what we're talking about next week. I didn't look at the schedule, but we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Pantry Chat.
Absolutely. Have a great week. We'll see you soon.
Goodbye.